I want my life. I want to experience life. It was just this drive more than anything. And I had the greatest trust in, you know, psychedelic medicines as something that's going to help me through. Even with that awful experience, I was willing to like, okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm not stopping.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Webdelics podcast, where we're on a journey to find out the truth about psychedelics and plant medicine, get rid of the myths, and change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is a very special guest. Now, before we go into who that special guest is, and I'm just so excited about it, I do want to start the episode by letting you know that this conversation is going to be very far-reaching, and it may get intense and deeply personal. If you're triggered by discussions of trauma or suicide or even suicide ideation, be aware that those topics are going to be part of the episode today. With that in mind, I'm proud to introduce to the audience of the Webdelics podcast the one and only Steve Elfrink. Steve Elfrink is the director of content here at Webdelics, but as you're going to find out, he is much, much more than that. I've heard it said that Steve Elfrink has forgotten more about psychedelics than I'll ever learn. I believe it too. But although that can seem overwhelming, this conversation also is with someone who's rich in his humanity, in his spirit, and with his openness. Steve, without further ado, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, Scott, first off, I really appreciate your enthusiasm around this work and everything that you're doing with Webdelics and with the podcast and how you're injecting your own personal life into these podcasts. So a big kudos to what you're doing and a big thank you for what you're doing. And then about myself, that could be an hour podcast. And so basically a guy who's been in the trenches for about 40 plus years, exploring different psychedelic medicines, went through corporate world, someone who's gone through extensive, dealings or, trying to process trauma, my life, the why of my life. And then someone who's been always an advocate for psychedelic medicines, for personal use, for helping others with these medicines, and now full-time in this world. So working with Webdelics as director of content, also my own practice called Terra, where I'm seeing clients, working with cannabis, ketamine, and a psychedelic somatic approach, and then also working now with psilocybin as a legal licensed psilocybin facilitator in the great state of Oregon. And with all this is just a mission and a passion to help folks. That's my greatest mission, is to help folks who are suffering or going through any level of wanting to know themselves better and diving deeper into their own personal why.
Steve, thank you for that introduction. I have to say, thank you for the remarks about my enthusiasm. It's sincere. What do we already have in common? Even just hearing that introduction, we are here to help people out. And so, Steve, truly, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to be here. I've been waiting for this. So this is
we've been waiting too. Now, the theme of today's episode is keeping it real. What psychedelics can and cannot do. We've promised from the very first episode of this show that we're not going to lie, that we're not just going to be mindless cheerleaders. We want to get to the truth, the good, the bad, the ugly, the promising, and what we don't know. And so the fact that you were willing to come on here and talk about this objectively goes as to everything that Webdelics is about. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, trauma is at the heart, as I understand it, of your psychedelic journey. And trauma is why I was interested in exploring the psychedelic world when I was first asked to host this podcast. We both had difficult childhoods. And I think it's fair to say that both of us, again, being honest and keeping it real for myself, have been through the pits in our lives from an early day and not necessarily seen the way out. But, Steve, I have to say, when I read your bio, there was something in it that jumped out and hit my heart like a sledgehammer. Because for those of us who remember what it's like to be a kid, who maybe are deeply in touch with their own inner kid, or who just see children and you see the lights in their eyes and the possibilities that they represent. What I read was that you first considered suicide at age 4.
Yeah. That one's, it's hard for me to even hear that. It's very, very sad. It was, my first memories were, earliest memories, somewhere in that 4 to 5 range. But the experience was, the memory was basically, it's brought up in Minnesota, Christian Lutheran background. And so nightly prayers, now I lay me down to sleep, that prayer. And then I'd go through the prayer, kneeling at my bed, and then I would end it with, please God, kill me in my sleep. Please God, kill me in my sleep. Please God, kill me in my sleep. And that's how, it's sad. I can feel that sadness for that kid. And that's how I'd go to bed. And then I remember waking up and I was alive. And then I was like, oh my God, I'm so awful of a child that God can't even take the time to kill me in my sleep. So I very greatly internalize that as like something's broken. And I'm putting kind of words to something that a 4 or 5 year old didn't fully have, but I also know the feeling tone of that child. And then also dipping in through work, what that child was, what he went through and what he was experiencing. And it made sense. So that was, suicide. I mean, for me, that was it was an attempt at that age because I didn't know anything other than there's this guy who answers your prayers. So maybe he'll kill me.
As you grew older and deeper into your childhood and then into your teen years, did things get better or did the state that you were in get worse or did it stay the same? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely fluctuated. There was another, it's called an experimental suicide attempt sometime when I was like 7 or 8, where I tried to electrocute myself with a cord or a plug-in that was plugged into a fan, put a coat hanger on it because I heard electricity would kill you. So there was just always this kind of, and then as a child, I didn't know what depression was. I just knew I didn't understand other than I didn't want to be here. And then a lot of nightmares, I'd have recurring nightmares and just very, very introverted to the, painfully introverted as a child. Through mainly for kindergarten was just hell, first grade, second grade, because I was just so introverted and so self-conscious and so just out of my skin and anxiety and scared. And then, I mean, it did shift. I found a great friend who really helped, found Monty Python, which really helped.
Hey. Right. Those things can be therapeutic. That was like me and Donna Summer. She saved my life.
Yeah, Monty Python really helped me. Because it was for me also, I think I never quite fit into my culture, my family. I was always, like parents flat out, just don't understand you. And so that was, I mean, there was some good phases. I mean, finding my friend Nate, call it to Nate, because he was a little off the wall, a little strange. And I finally found someone, kind of a buddy. Yeah. So that was huge. He was kind of my first really good friend. So that was helpful. But then also I was at that age, or this was actually about 7 or 8, I was also really questioning status quo and religion and religious dogma at like 7 or 8, where I heard if you hear the Lord's name in vain, you'll be struck by lightning. Yeah. I'm like, wow, that doesn't make sense. Yeah. How does that work? So I'm the guy that went in, or a kid at 7 who went in the backyard, making sure no one's around, and stood there and dropped F-bombs at God and Jesus, waiting for the lightning. And then when it didn't happen, I'm like, okay, there's some false reality here that I'm being presented. So I was always in this like questioning. Things didn't make sense. I didn't understand myself. My parents didn't understand me. So there was always this just angst of who am I? And then, yeah, eventually it was always rough, but kind of, it was kind of like looking back at it and even talking about it now, there was kind of this forward presenting persona. And then inside was always this kind of turmoil. And I can remember, hitting levels of dissociation, or I'd be walking to school and then all of a sudden I'm like, who am I? Or just, where am I? And just little glitches in the, time matrix of my life. And all these little things started to make me wonder, like, what's wrong with me? And then I'll go ahead and ask a thing.
Yeah,
I want to segue a little eventually into the teen years.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about those. But before we get into that, one of the things, again, that I can relate to that you're talking about is that when you feel you're socially awkward, in my case, it was because the family situation that I was in was so violent, so unpredictable, and I was viewed as weird and awkward. I mean, I'm a biracial boy that was I was adopted by and raised by African Americans in a black family in rural Midwest that made it pretty clear they were uncomfortable with someone who looked like me around in the family. Yeah. And at the same time, I would go to school. I was nerdy. I was, like you, quiet. I was shy. I was not confident. People pick up on that. And it was an environment where there was a lot of hostility and bullying that would come my way. So I didn't have a safe space at home. I didn't have a safe space at work. I really didn't have a safe space. Now, eventually, I went into counseling, and the response was there was some talk therapy, but the big response was to give me antidepressants. Oof. I've got to say, for all the antidepressants I took, I don't recall any results. It wasn't like the talk therapy stopped. It wasn't like I stopped feeling bad. Really, the only thing that made me feel better was I moved when I was an adult. That's what made things better. Did you go through anything like that? And what began to turn things around with you during your teenage years?
So I never, was, as a child, never put into counseling or anything. What turned my life around, and in a bad way, was at 13, discovered drugs and alcohol. When I discovered like an escape. And also one of my tormentors was my older brother, and perpetrators was my older brother. And it was the first time, once he was able to get me drunk and wasted, that, he wasn't, there wasn't the physical abuse or other abuse happening. So it was this kind of window of, being accepted by my, big brother. He's not beating me up anymore. And I'm getting relief from this internal, angst that I don't understand. And I found a persona of just, this stoner druggie. Mm-hmm. And it was like, and it was a circle of friends and just getting wasted. It started at 13, which is sad.
At 13?
13, yeah. Drinking alcohol, smoking weed, taking Darvon, nitroglycerin tablets, Valium. It was like, what is it? I'll take it. You're supposed to take 3. Give me 10. I mean, just whatever. I'll take it. And then during school, blacking out in school, missing a day here and there from the Valium. But it was just escaping.
Yeah, well, while this was going on, were you aware that it was dysfunctional, or were you just like, this is what I feel like doing and I'm going to do it?
It was that. It was relief. It was my brother's not beating me up. It's just this, this contained person who discovered all of a sudden just this altered state that took me away from all this, stuff I didn't understand. So it became like very dysfunctional. But it also, I can't say saved me by any level, but it gave me relief from what I was dealing with. But then,
were your parents aware? Were your parents aware of what was going on, or?
No, I was youngest of four. This is, product of the 70s, born in 1963. So 13, math on that. 76, 70, what's the math? I'm bad at math. Anyway, product of the 70s. It was just kind of rampant. They went through challenges with my older brothers and sisters. By the time I came around, it's just like, okay, just kind of hands off.
Yeah.
And maybe a little oblivious, I guess, to it.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing, I was doing well. I could be high. I was always high at school, but on some drug, and then partying weekends and everything. But I always got straight A's. I always did very well in school, and I made it through school. But on the back end was a very out of control child or teenager.
Grades notwithstanding, being absolutely honest, I hear these behaviors being engaged in. I think of a young boy who is bright, who is desperate for escape, and who is doing everything, sounds like, under the sun. This could have ended up a genuine tragedy. What kept it from being that way?
Grace of God. I was doing everything. Some of this is hard. I shouldn't say hard to admit, but it's just the truth. Drinking, blackout drinking where, my friends, I'm so wasted that lifting me up in the car and turning the car on for me and getting the, car to go into drive and sending me off.
Wow.
And so many times there were so many times I could have died mainly from drinking, excessive drinking. Binge plus drinking, and then combining all these different substances. I don't know. I shouldn't be here. But for some reason, Scott, I'm here. And I think part of that is everything I went through, and we'll get more into some of the trauma stuff. But I really believe I'm here now to help folks. And something, grace of God, life's destiny, soul plan, divine plan, kept me here to then be in service for folks who have gone through challenging experiences. And I think also I kind of went through everything someone can go through as far as from trauma, sexual abuse, sadism, and then the drug alcohol thing, divorces, bankruptcy. Pretty much every horrendous thing someone can go through, been there. So I think to answer you, I think I was, grace of God, grace of source, whatever you want to call it.
It is amazing. The older I get, the more deeply I come to understand and appreciate the cliche that trauma, that horrible things in your life, that the places you go that are the bottom of the abyss really can be gifts if you're able to survive them in time.
100% agree.
But it wasn't just happenstance, as I understand it, that turned things around. You came into exposure to LSD at some point, did you not?
Yeah. Yeah, that was huge for me. But not for the right reasons. But I started doing LSD when I was 16 and love at first dose. It was just so profound, but not in that mystical, what most people would assume with LSD. But for me, it was I could drink more alcohol and I could be more out of control. I could just, I found my alcohol limits went through the roof. I could be more just crazy with LSD.
That is actually fascinating. And it goes as to a couple of interesting qualities of LSD. First of all, although LSD is in the minds of many members of the public, the first thing that they think of when they hear the word psychedelics, particularly if they were children of the 70s or the 80s or even the 90s, you think about 60s hippies at Woodstock or somewhere like that on LSD, tripping away, to use the common slang for that at the time. But as the psychedelic renaissance has moved forward, the discussion has not really focused on LSD. To the extent that LSD has come up in the context of this show, it has usually come up, and a prior guest by the name of Gretchen Jones has particularly interesting insights about its role in the psychedelic experience, at least as far as her own journey is concerned. It has come up as part of a therapeutic or trauma responsive pool of psychedelic resources that people can draw from.
Yes.
You're talking about this in a way that's very, very different. And I think it's important to point that out and to maybe hear your thoughts about this, because what you're talking about is the reality, which is that LSD, as do some of these other substances, exist not just to help people with trauma, although clearly they can, and we're going to talk more about that. But there is this side of them that can be used this way to
or abused.
Put yourself and others in more and more danger if you're not conscious about it. And so that goes as to one of the fundamental questions that I have, and maybe can be a brief rabbit hole that we go down, which goes as to what degree of availability and legalization or decriminalization should occur when it comes to some of these substances. Because your example points to, well, you know, there are those guests that we've had on this show that are like, look, make this available to everyone. There's too much suffering out there. There's too much trauma that needs to be healed. But as I'm hearing this, this could also make trauma worse. It could spread trauma. If you were to have a more voracious appetite for alcohol, or you or someone else, and then get in a car and drive, there's not going to be a lot of happiness that spread because of that LSD dose.
No. And I'm, I should, just a caveat to all this. I'm kind of on the extreme side of everything.
I love it.
As far as the depth of trauma, the depth of drug use that I went through for a phase, the extreme on, challenging experiences with psychedelics. I could be the poster boy for, off the charts, awful psychedelic experiences. So I'm the extreme case. I'm not in any means a normal case out there, but I'm also, from coming through all this and then working, some years in the underground world and then also now above ground world, very cautious when it comes to these substances. So I'm a little bit more reserved, or not reserved, but just cautious in how these should be distributed, who should be using them. And I'd like to kind of shelve that a little bit, because I think we can segue a little bit more into that as we go down the road here. But I also want to add, the beautiful thing about LSD was it started to give me some glimpses of maybe something bigger than thyself.
Well, and that's in particular what I wanted us to also spend some time discussing as well. We will get to some of these other subjects later, because anyone who researches you for more than 5 minutes will get a sense that you have what I consider a very realistic approach to what these substances are and what they mean from a public policy perspective. So yes. I can't wait for us to begin to move down that part of the conversation, but we'll get there in a few minutes. Talk to us a little bit about LSD and this mystical experience, because this mystical stuff is what interests a lot of people, and in a way it's the most human of all. Yeah,
so LSD is a beautiful, beautiful substance and a beautiful molecule, and I can honestly, unequivocally look, Scott, since you're in front of me, look you in the eye, look anyone in the eye and say, if it wasn't for LSD, I wouldn't be here.
Wow.
And thank you, Albert Hofmann. I owe my life to Albert Hofmann. For folks who don't know, he's the one who discovered LSD in 1938. And so through my extensive, many experiences with LSD, I had one, I won't go deep into this one, but one where I did, it was 1,600 micrograms with a friend, and normal dose 100 to 300. 300 would be fee, but I was always do a lot. But ended up with 1,600 micrograms, camping, air quotes, and had a, a bit of a shift of telepathy and light coming out of everywhere. And it was something that kind of like made me go, huh, maybe there's something else here. But then it was just still like more drugs, more alcohol. But it gave a glimpse. And then the big life changer for me and the most positive experience I ever had from LSD was, so I ended up, I'll keep this part brief, but ended up in a psych ward when I was 19 from a suicide attempt, spent 30 days there, which was a joke to me, and then ended up from another suicide attempt in a drug treatment center, almost got kicked out because I was not complying, and then into a halfway house for 3 months. So I also know that whole world. Got back into college, was kind of a success, got a good paying job, entered the corporate world. This is about 29 or so. Went through my first marriage and divorce, but was in this like the cultural norm of success, of a good paying job and a nice apartment, moved from Minnesota to Arizona, and all of a sudden just crippling depression came back, and the suicidality, the intrusive thoughts. And it was a point where I'm like, okay, I've done everything I'm supposed to do that culture has told me. I got this job, I'm making money, I'm a member of society, and I just want to die. And I never did anything super intense. I mean, for me, intense suicide is gun. And so this was going to be, okay, I'm going to do a huge dose of LSD. If that doesn't work, permanent solution. So with that intent, did an LSD session on my own, which don't recommend. And with just this, knowing it could go totally south, because I was suicidal when I did it. And knowing it could go south, that it may happen during that session, or I could just not work and I'm just in an awful place, and then go to plan, kill myself plan. But as you can see, I'm still here. Gratefully. So that night was probably, I would say, one of the top experiences of my life. Again, I was about 29, Scottsdale, Arizona, my apartment, sourced 1,200 micrograms of pure liquid LSD I went to a Neil Young concert. Specifically, I'm going to find LSD, went to the back where all people hang out and trade drugs, found a vial of liquid LSD. Took it. So I did 1,200 micrograms, and definitely the most profound experience of my life. And what happened in that night was, it was a classic mystical experience, unity consciousness. But for me, that the LSD kicked in it was like 5 minutes. It was just rapid onset, and was in a point where like, oh man, I got to go lay down, because I was in the living room. Okay, I'm going to go to my bedroom. This is really intense. Open the door to my bedroom, and I can still feel this moment where I opened the door and my whole bedroom was just shimmering in light, just beautiful light, shimmering. And I was like, just this kind of state of disbelief, and this like trying to understand where the light was coming from. And then I looked down at me, and there was no longer me. It was just, became pure white light. And I was just emanating this pure, there it is. It was so profound from this kid who, never experienced anything other than, being wasted or, abused or just all this awful stuff, to have this moment. That's what I'm kind of feeling right now. But just this pure white light, and it just consumed me, and in a beautiful way I was this pure white light. And then I thought, I want to see this in the mirror. What does this look like? So I walked in, they always say, don't look in the mirror, but I went to the bathroom to look in the mirror I wanted to see the white light. What is this? And then when I got to the mirror, I saw myself. It was my face. And I was, in that moment, the most beautiful man that ever existed. But then it wasn't about me, because my face then morphed into another face, and then another face, and then another face. And it was male, female, and it just literally just unfolded into infinity of humans, of faces, and that we all have this white light. We are all this. And it was, again, it's this classic, really, really deep unity consciousness place of we're all this. And then from there, I actually have goosebumps even talking about this.
Yeah.
It was so
I'm getting
visceral of an
goosebumps even
experience.
hearing it, frankly.
And then so I got back into the living room, and then for the next 6 hours plus, I kind of pretty much lost time. But my apartment ceased to exist, and then I was just this is that ineffable place, the William James, the ineffable of no words. But I was still this kind of pure white light, but then it became concentrated around my heart, or where my heart would be.
Yeah.
And love was just pure love, but not a mental love, but just the energy of love was just pouring out of my heart into the universe. But then it was reciprocated back from the universe. So I was giving and receiving love into the universe. And because it's not rapture, it's not bliss, it's not an ecstatic state. It's just, there's no words for where I was, other than, mystical unity consciousness, all is one, all that. And then there was also a phase of just tears and tears and tears, but it was this mixed with gratitude and sadness and just this emotional, just not a roller coaster in a bad way, but just things were just coming out of me, but all within the framework of this, reciprocal place of love and love and love and love and love. And it was life-changing.
I can
Really life-changing.
only imagine, what were you thinking as you were experiencing this? Were you afraid? Were you beyond a place of thinking? Were you just writing it? How was your intellect processing this, or was your intellect shut off as you were going on what sounds like, this word kind of trivializes what you just described, but it's honestly the best one that I can think of, and you used it yourself ambivalently, this roller coaster ride.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. The first part, like the bedroom, white light, I was aware that I was in an apartment and there was Steve, consciously using mind to go to the bathroom, seeing at the mirror. That was, within the realms of some ego on board a little bit. But once I laid down, there was no intellect. There was no Steve. I was gone. It was just this pure experience of light and love, emotions that I wasn't like I'm crying. It was just, I guess some awareness of that more, but just in it, in God's cradle, or whatever you want to call that place. But not even God's cradle, because I was God, and there is no God, and there is nothing but this love, light place. But it's beyond love and light. I mean, there's a kind of phrase love and light, but it's beyond that. Or my experience was beyond that. Again, there's no words for this place that fully embraces the intensity and the beauty and the power of that moment. And it shifted everything for me.
I want to get to that shift in a few minutes, but there are a couple of things that I want to ask for more information about. Sure. When I'm hearing this, I can't be the only one that's a little bit scared contemplating it, because what I'm also hearing is the wiping out of one's individual identity. If you're a unified consciousness or a unity consciousness or whatever the term is that you used, if you are one with God, God is you, well then Steve Elfrink is gone. Isn't that terrifying? Isn't that disturbing? What about all of the things that make you unique? What about all of the things that make you special? Isn't that just removing them from the universe?
No, I appreciate the question and the pondering of that. But in that state, and it's just a state. For me, all these are just states. They're temporary states. And on some levels, they mean everything. And on some levels, they mean nothing. It was a state. I experienced a state. Grateful for that state. But in that state of no you, if there's no you, there's no one to be terrified. There's no one to be scared, because there is no I. So it's that non-dual place. But with no I, there's no suffering. With no I, there's no terror. In that place of unity consciousness, non-duality, you are just pure light. And that's all you know, because there is no I.
That is deep. That's wow. I almost don't even know where to begin with that, but I think that that's one of those statements that is worth just sort of laying on the table, letting sit there, and then we can look at it and think about it and ponder it as we ponder the many things that have already been discussed in this episode and that will be discussed going forward. Let me also ask you this. Do you think that what you were experiencing was literally a step into a universal consciousness, or do you think it was all just your brain going haywire?
100% universal consciousness.
Why do you think that?
That's a good question. Why do I think that? Direct experience. I'm a fan of direct experience. I learned that one. Well, credit to Terence McKenna of how do you feel when you experience this? That place of direct experience, because it is so outside of anything mind could come up with or brain could come up with. There is no mind, there is no brain. And there's such a felt sense of, that experience. How do you put this to words? You just know. You just know. There's no question for me of that. There's this collective consciousness, unity consciousness, that this thing bigger than ourselves exists. And this came from, a nihilistic atheist prior to this session. And I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, Scott, but it's just a knowing. And you can't erase that knowing. I unequivocally, and also I think the universe, we know so very little of what's out there. It's, bigger and weirder than we can imagine in a beautiful way, which I love. That was always my challenge with religion, that it just minimized the mystery and this intense insanity in a good way of the complexity of what's out there. That where does this white light exist? Where did that originate from? I don't care, but I know it's there.
What you're speaking about right now goes as to one of the most profound themes that has peeked its head up above the waters of the subconscious of almost everyone who we've spoken to on this show, which is that what we're witnessing and experiencing in our day-to-day lives and what people experience when they go into psychedelic states seem to be, if not outright distinct from each other, very much diving into the fullness of what actually is versus what we can actually perceive.
Yes.
It's interesting. So I went to college in Minnesota. I spent a lot of time near the Minneapolis area. I am very familiar with the Lutheran Church and how it expresses itself as a faith tradition, how people live it and experience it. I also grew up in a fundamentalist church that was fire and brimstone and hell. And one of the things that I had as my building block of thinking and personal evolution in reaction to this fundamentalist raising was kind of like what you're saying. Everything was about rules. You don't do this, you don't do that. You do this when you're in church. You go to church every week and you sit there and you're quiet and you trash women who might have had an abortion, or you trash gay people or whatever. And if you do that, then you're a good person. And I hated it. So as it sounds like might have happened with you, I reacted to it by going into this very, very hardcore atheistic state for a long time. There's nothing out there outside of what I can see, because religion is all just a bunch of myths that people use to control others, until I began to have, outside of any psychedelic experience at all, an internal spiritual revolution. And I mention that because the spiritual revolution began with an intuitive sense that came from the place where my heart is in my body. I'm even getting a little bit of a chill thinking about it now, as an understanding that there was a lot more out there than what we can see, feel, and touch.
Yes, definitely. It's a big world.
It is. Feeling that and suspecting it and even being willing to act on it like I did, though, is vastly different than entering beneath the waves of this vast sea of what the subconscious, or what the universal conscious, perhaps more properly, would be. And so I cannot begin to imagine the impact that this would have had on your life. How did it feel having what it sounds like for the first time as being a sense of real joy in a life that since you were 4 years old had been dominated, being blunt, by depression, acting out, and suicidal ideation? When you came out of this, what were you thinking? What were you feeling?
Great question. I want to rewind 1 second just to...
Please.
Because I want to add into... basically about the mystical experience, and the way I understand this and the way it makes sense to me, and what came out of all the 60s research, is these substances take away the filter of life, because we have these constricting reality filters that try to keep us into this understandable world so we can function. And it made sense. We had to put in these filters of what life is. And these substances, especially, I'm not advocating large doses, that's just what I needed at that time, take those filters away and open us to what is real. And that's where a lot of people say some of these experiences are more real than real. Like my white light experience and all that was more real than anything here on earth. But for me, it's also, don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's just a state. And for me, through all this work I've done, all the medicines I've done, now more of an appreciation for just being a monkey here on earth. Because for me, I was always trying to transcend. And I don't regret those, especially this LSD experience, because it saved my life. But again, it's nice to know that. And I think everyone deserves, as a human, to at some point experience a mystical experience, because it's part of who we are, part of what we're connected to. So, so basically just wanted to rewind and say, these just, take the filters that, evolutionarily, we've had these filters to kind of constrict reality. And these medicines allow us to go outside of that reality to what's true. So what's true?
Well, Steve Elfrink.
Yes, sir.
If you open the door to a rabbit hole, you should know your homie Scott is going to go down it at least a little way. Let me ask you this question then, though, because this is, to me, raising one of the potential scary things about the psychedelic renaissance, or about the psychedelic experience itself, which is, if these filters were given to us in order to support our evolutionary needs, isn't getting rid of them putting us at profound risk?
I wouldn't say profound risk. There is risk within, and we'll get more into this with a little bit with psychedelics and trauma. There's some risk, but I don't see any risk for someone to have a mystical experience when they're ready for it, when it's the right time and someone has a mystical experience. Because it's a temporary state. You experience that state and then you come back with a whole different perspective. And for me, it was, if I segue to that, an incredibly beneficial, perspective. Again, someone who thought the world was pretty much in a box, black and white. There is no God. You die and you rot in the earth. That was pretty much my perspective to, and no, someone who wasn't connected to folks, not bonded really anywhere, to then experiencing this place of unity consciousness. We're all one. That's all valuable information. And I think also information our society needs. Yeah. Especially with the wars going on. The insanity of our world right now. But once you realize, I am that person, because we're all one. We truly believe that there's this, grand source, whatever that is. We all contain this, and what people see as just different aspects of someone else. But at the end of the day, we're all pure white light.
Well, and that
Sounds
goes
crazy, but
no, I don't think it sounds crazy at all. And one of the things that you spoke about in your experience that I want to dwell on briefly before we move on back into the aftermath is when you looked in the mirror and you saw all of these faces that basically you seem to say were the faces of everyone. I mean, I'm hearing this as basically the faces of everyone who ever lived.
that was the feeling, the sense.
Okay. Well, and considering, what you were going through and this was a mystical experience, it sounds to me like if that's what you're feeling and that what your sense was, that's more or less what was happening. I mean,
That's my experience. Yeah.
Right. And well, with that in mind, then, do you think, and are you saying that this was your first understanding of not only is there this great source that we're part of and there's this great set of experiences and this white light that we all may dissolve our ego into, but that we literally are manifestations of each other on this planet? That in a way, you and I could be talking to each other as people talking to ourselves right
On
now,
some degree,
if we were to perceive things differently.
Yes, I think we're all products of the collective consciousness. I believe everything, every thought, every whisper, every feeling is uploaded to whatever. And do I understand this? No. Where does this go? Is it the supercomputer in the sky? No, it's way more complicated than that. But we're all children of the collective consciousness. And that's the source, the white light, whatever that is. But there is... And I've had these non-dual experiences throughout different points in my life of just, with even, again, some of this sounds crazy, but, with a moment of staring at a birch tree in the winter in Minnesota or Wisconsin, and this sense of I am that, just out of the blue, I am that birch. And just, struck like, not a bolt of lightning, but it, put me on the floor of just this sense that there is no separation. Even if it's a birch tree, and it's and it's not like, it's not a thought. It's the only way I can explain it is a download of, especially that I am that place. It's just this knowing that there is no separation. And then that goes for me to any person I meet is I am that. And that really helps with judgment.
I bet it does. Steve, nonetheless, there will be those who are listening to or watching this show who are like, okay, that's too woo for me. But one thing that I will say is probably not too woo for anybody is that you said that you left this experience a different person. I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. And I acknowledge and I want to agree. Some of this sounds woo. Some of it sounds crazy on some levels. And I know also it's my direct experience. For me, it was real. And also it's shaped who I am today, and I'm grateful for who I am today.
Thank you.
And so the benefit factor was tremendous. I mean, it was like a switch went off of, someone who's, suicidal. I didn't really, I never slept that night, but walked out that morning into the Arizona suns, the sunrise, the cactus, everything. Reborn. I mean, because I went from suicidal to just, oh my God, I'm alive. Oh my God, I'm part of this. Oh my God, this is me. This is, I'm just this, like, I'm alive in this, like, beautiful, beautiful world. And everything was, it was, probably still a little effective with the LSD, but I was like seeing for the first time.
Oh my God.
Not seen with this dark filter of depression, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, all that, and just like seeing the world as it is and this clarity.
Did this last?
Yeah, great question. So yes and no. So this is also a nice segue into where we can take this. So it was like a pivotal shift in my life. Because it just opened me to new possibilities. It opened me to really want to do more for, self-care. And so it kind of, keep it brief, but it just launched me into changing my diet, like organic foods. I want to eat better. It got me into alternative healings, and doors just started opening. I found this dear, dear friend, Alan, down in Tucson, Arizona, who was a quarter Cherokee. And I started working with him in like shamanic work. He wouldn't say he's a shaman, but he never owned that, but it was shamanic work, doing sweat lodges and rituals in the desert. And this was, a white guy from Minnesota who just knew mac and cheese and, Jesus. And everything just kept opening up, got into primal scream therapy, ecstatic dance. Ecstatic dance was huge for me. Just like, oh my God, I can like move and dance and feel the rhythm, and got really into the didgeridoo, and, Didge was huge, doing, performances with Didge. And it just, opened me to a whole new world of people, relationships, self-work, personal work, more shamanic work. But then any questions on that before I segue off into something else?
No, please segue off. I want to hear what happened, where all of this led you, and how this led you more deeply into the world of plant medicines and psychedelics.
Yeah, so the beautiful thing was, so it definitely set me on a path of, deeper respect for plant medicines. And so it continued, started still working with LSD some, more psilocybin, but more in this nature-based, spiritual, going in, did my first ibogaine session, was with a group of folks who were, really pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Did ibogaine, which is a lot of people haven't heard of, but I know you're familiar with it.
But it can never hurt to be repeated, because this may be someone's very first episode. And so maybe if you could briefly just say what that is, so anyone who's new to this will know.
Yeah. So this was, so I hit this place where I was just like, I'm going to do everything possible to work on myself. So I was on this mission. So willing, not, before I would try anything just to be wasted. Now it was, I will try anything. If this is going to help me, I'll do it. But with that intent from a therapeutic approach, which again, that was a shift from, the LSD of I'm now interested in thyself,
right?
Healing thyself. So ibogaine was with that mission, and ibogaine is, I'll keep this brief. It comes from a African shrub that grows in the Congo region. And the medicine is from the root bark of the iboga plant. And it comes from a specific tribe called the Bwiti, which is Bwiti, and came into fashion or vogue, it's not even fashion, but Howard Lotsoff in New York, a heroin addict, stumbled upon it, and kind of that, I'll do any drug. But hardcore heroin addict took it, and the experience can last up to 36 hours. So it's a very deep, it's not intense in a bad way, but just, it's big medicine. And Howard went through that experience, came out of it 36 hours later, and was no longer, had any cravings for heroin. And also he went through no withdrawal symptoms. So 36 hours, no heroin, any hardcore heroin addict is going to go into withdrawal. But he had no withdrawal symptoms and was no cravings, and went through this. It does a psycho-spiritual evaluation of your life, and never did heroin again. So its first entry into the U.S. Was more for heroin addiction. So there was kind of an underground community starting around that, and then it spread out more into psycho-spiritual. So just from the framework of we're all addicts at some level. We get habitual patterns, thoughts, whatever. We have some levels of addiction. So that's why I kind of went into it. And I'm sorry, what'd you say, Scott?
Coffee.
Yes, coffee. That's definitely can be one. And it was an incredibly profound experience. And all these experiences just kind of led me along this path. But then what I started finding as I was going through more LSD experiences, psilocybin experiences, they were starting to get rougher and tougher and more challenging.
What do you mean by that?
Well, more like I would hit, one experience comes to mind of, I kind of like a glitch in the matrix. All of a sudden, in hindsight, what I was hitting is dissociation. Because all of a sudden I'd be like in this experience, and all of a sudden I'd be like, and it wasn't a who am I in the mystical sense. It was like all of a sudden this disconnect from, it was like there's two Steves, and I don't know which Steve's here, and this weird, not comfortable place. And then a little bit of panic starting to come in, and more anxiety starting to come in. I remember doing like a 3 gram, therapeutic session, by myself. I was doing, a lot of work on my own, but always psychotherapeutic and just really staying with it, staying with the experience, grounding myself in, trying to clear stuff out. But all of a sudden, like, just terror started coming in and panic. So then I'm like, okay, I'll take more, trying to work through it. And then the, terror and panic started to build. So it was starting to get more challenging experiences, and more like stuff started coming out of my skin. Like my skin would start to hurt. Like it was just like energy, air quotes. Stuff was like, it was just very uncomfortable. And it kept getting kind of more and more challenging. And then also within that, sometimes like this depression, anxiety was starting to come back too in day-to-day life. I was doing all this work and everything, and then it started to, stuff started creeping back in.
What do you think was going on with all that? Do you think, for instance, someone who's hearing this, who's totally not from the psychedelic world, may simply say, well, he was ODing on psychedelics, or he was substituting psychedelics for the personal work that you need to do that the psychedelics only supplement, or that you were somehow doing these things and they were reacting to your body had hit a tolerance level beyond which it couldn't go any further. Or maybe the spiritual world, if they embrace what you said earlier about what was behind the LSD experience you had, maybe the spirit world was saying, you've seen enough of us for now. Or maybe none of that. What would you, if you have any thoughts about what was really going on, share
100%.
that with us.
Yeah. So again, great question, Scott. So for me, 100% now in hindsight, it was trauma. Starting to, all this repressed everything that I went through, which for me started at birth, went till about 13, multiple perpetrators. All that was starting to bubble up. But I wasn't aware of, I knew of some inklings of some stuff that happened in my childhood that I just kind of went, that wasn't a big deal. But stuff was starting to come up to the surface. So I had, I think, done enough to start, working through some, in hindsight, again, we can go into this deeper as we go, but around dissociation. So all of my dissociative system that shut down everything started to crack a little bit. So some of this trauma was starting to emerge. So some of the terror, some of the panic. So all the stuff I went through as a child, where I was in a fight, flight, or freeze. As a child, we can't fight back. We don't have any options. So our only option is to go into a dissociative state, which is the freeze, where we're actually flooded with endogenous opioids, shuts down the system. But then what happened preceding that dissociative kind of wave lives on in the body. So some of the stuff was starting to come out, and it was very unpleasant, but it was gradual.
Yeah.
Also, sorry, Scott. One thing else,
please.
Caveat to all this, and it wasn't like I was, this would be every 3 months, 6 months. It wasn't like continually doing, just like I had done previously. It was always within a psychotherapeutic container, but it started to devolve on me.
I'm glad you clarified that, because that actually does address a potential audience question, which is, well, were you doing this stuff every day? But be that as it may, thank you for that. One thing that you're pointing to, and there's a lot of $5 words that I want to make sure that we spend a few minutes to unpack, one $5 word in particular that I want to make sure that we unpack. Well, what I'm beginning to hear, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's a differentiation between feeling better and resolving the underlying issues that caused you to feel bad in the first place. When you use the word dissociative, I don't even know what that means. Is that meaning that somehow you are diving into the place that is where the trauma actually resided, as opposed to just feeling better? Or does it mean something else?
It means basically you're just tapping into unresolved emotions, unresolved feelings. And this is actually a great place to kind of do a quick fast forward.
Yeah.
Because I want to go into something that's going to really dive deeper into this from personal experience, and then it'll put more context around it. Okay. Cool with the fast forward?
Hell yeah.
So I'm going to, so we
Hey,
left
we're in the
off.
psychedelic space. We're beyond time and space anyway, right?
Yes, there is no time.
What is
there
it
is
all
no space.
exactly?
And we're one with time and space.
Right.
So I'm gonna leave off where, okay, psychedelics, whether it's mushrooms, LSD, I'm starting to, something's not good here. And then life shifted. I ended up, married back in the, because I kind of got a little bit out of the corporate world, got back into the corporate world. And for 10 years, I would call it a corporate blob. So for 10 years, like onesie, twosie, very minimal psychedelic experiences, no personal work. I just became dad, provider, had 4 kids. And my focus was 100% work and traveling all over the world, which was cool, but I was just go, go. And part of the corporate machine in corporate ophthalmology, working in sales, education, marketing, all that stuff. But it was just a phase where no personal work. So I went from this really intense personal work into stuff starting to come up, and then kind of stopped because I was like, what's going on? And then went into distraction mode and dad mode. And that became my life. But during that time, all of a sudden, depression still coming back, anxiety's coming back, suicidal ideation, but not as strong to the planning phase, intrusive thoughts. So I had kind of this rough 10-year phase of I'm showing up, doing the job, doing all that, but inside it's like, this isn't good. So a lot of times for folks, like crisis can lead to change or demise. So what crisis hit me was 2012. My wife at the time saying, I'm no longer attracted to you. And I don't know if I want to be in this relationship. I'm not sure what this means.
Wow.
And for me, that was a wake-up call. I mean, it was devastating, but then I just thought, okay, how am I not attracted to myself? So, and I also knew like, okay, I've become somewhat of this corporate blob. I haven't done any work, personal work. So for me, it was a wake up. It was, gut wrenching, and then, eventually led to divorce. Gut wrenching experience, but it also was a catalyst for me. Like, okay, I got to do something with my life. And again,
How old were you, Steve?
2012. What's the math? I'm 60 now. I'm terrible with dates, ages. 40.
We'll do the calculations. You're probably around, you're probably around 50, 51, sounds like.
48, I think.
48.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah. Okay. Late 40s, early 50s. That's what matters. Hey, I'm horrible at math, so please don't ask me to add or subtract. You're just going to make a fool out of me, even more so than I already make a fool out of myself.
Yeah, math is definitely not. When it comes to numbers, I'm not present. But so I just dove back into psychedelic work, started with ibogaine. This would have been my 3rd ibogaine session. 2017, because I remember I went for my ibogaine session on a Saturday, Sunday, and then went to a MAPS, the Psychedelic Science 2017 conference. And it was somewhat life-changing going through that, ibogaine experience, kind of a life reset. Then going into the MAPS environment, made up with at work that I was going to a wedding.
I'm telling.
So I could go to that conference and I was pretty much blown open in a good way from ibogaine. This reset's like, oh, here I am. And then meeting all the, the people, the others. And part of this phase also was I knew I needed community. So I'm a big community guy, community. So this is when I got involved. So I've been friends with Dennis McKenna for like 12 years now. So he was also part of this huge catalyst for me because I brought him I was living in Little Viroqua, Wisconsin, and brought Dennis in for his Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss launch. He was doing presentations. I brought him, my sole intent to bring him to Viroqua was to do a presentation so I could meet people who are interested in psychedelics. I knew I needed community, so it worked. So got into ibogaine, I tried MDMA, didn't work, which was starting to make me go, So I was a non-responder to MDMA, which now I understand, but then I didn't. And I'll go into that because it ties to dissociation. But then, so I was just doing everything possible to just really work on thyself. And so part of that, and this is a big chunk here, I chose to do a 3-day ayahuasca ceremony. And prior to that, I had done ayahuasca. I had a friend who was a brewmaster for the Santo Daime, got some ayahuasca from him, but ended up in this like 12 hours of just pure hell. And so I was going into this 3-day experience with a little trepidation, but that 12 hours was probably, and I've done ayahuasca by myself in a hotel and positive experience, up the dose a little bit, and just ended up 12 hours of like literally almost called 911. But then just the thought of someone coming in to the room, because I was just in this pure terror, pure panic state. Like writhing in terror and panic from 6 to 6. Yeah, 12 hours. It was 12 hours, 6 to 6. And you have a question?
Yeah, I am glad that you raised this because I had wanted to make sure that we went here in one way or the other. Ayahuasca is actually one of the most talked about substances on this show, and it's in the current public discussion around the psychedelic renaissance. Outside of psilocybin, probably the one that you hear the most about. Maybe ketamine too, but I would say more people seem to be aware of, when I talk to them on the street, about ayahuasca than anything outside of psilocybin. And it's interesting because when you hear about this over and over, I hear stories about, oh, I purged, oh, I had a bad part of the experience, or something, it was intense, but I don't hear, and we have certainly not had a lot of guests on this show who are so frank to say that I had an experience that was so bad, I was considering calling 911. Because to me, you know, if we're only hearing, and part of the beauty of what you're saying is that if we're only hearing these stories about how wonderful, even if there is purging or even if there is emotionalism during it, but without talking about the fear, we're really only talking about part of the story. And like you said earlier, the entire psychedelic experience is not only what we're here to discuss candidly and forthrightly, but it is also part of the entire human experiences. If, as you say, the psychedelic experience in particular brings the entire human experience together in a way that nothing else does.
Yes, yes. And again, I'm on the extreme side of pretty much everything. And a lot of my experiences aren't normal, but I'm also a guy in the world and these things happen. So yeah, so I went through 12 hours of like, I mean, just literally, I couldn't sit still for more than 5 seconds. I felt like my, head was going to explode. I just felt like I was going insane. I tried to take a shower to like let the water calm me down, but the water was too intense. The shower curtain was intense. And it wasn't like I was hallucinating. I was just in pure terror, pure panic. And like at one point, I knew I felt like I was going to purge, but what I threw up was coat hangers. All of a sudden, coat hangers just start coming out of me into the bed. And then I'm freaked out because there's coat hangers coming out of me, and more terror, more panic. It was awful. It was just horrendously awful. And I didn't understand it. And I just knew like, okay, I'm like a non-responder to MDMA. I could do it, it's like pure, it's, quality MDMA. Tried it with, sitters, male, female dyad, headphones, eye shades, no response, do a booster, just this amplified blank place. So I'm starting to go, what's going on here? So I'm having non-responder to MDMA, horrific experience on ayahuasca. And no clue to like, this is all trauma. I mean, everything I'm talking about, the non-response to MDMA, trauma. My experience from the ayahuasca, trauma and dissociation and what's underneath the dissociation. So I entered this 3-night ceremony, perfect set and setting, group of, people that I knew and loved, a guy trained by Don Jose Campos. If people know ayahuasca, Don Jose Campos is like kind of the godfather of ayahuasca, brew directly from Don Jose Campos. Perfect set and setting. Went through 3-night ceremony, second night, probably the most intense, but it was just, snakes coming through me everywhere.
Wow.
But it wasn't like bad. I just like, okay, they're working it through and these shamanic battles and entities and condor. I mean, it's kind of a classic intense ayahuasca experience. It wasn't too much for me, but it was deep. And even, the ayahuasca, they're at the end of the ceremony, everyone's, starting to clear out of the yurt. I'm still just in it, but not in a bad way. It's just like, oh, it's lingering. And then, kind of came through that second night, and then went back the third night, and kind of intense, but not as intense. But it was kind of like, I didn't really get much out of that. It felt like a lot of eye candy, and it didn't feel like what I'm always looking for is more of a therapeutic container. And I was kind of thinking, well, maybe ayahuasca is not my medicine. I had the snakes, had all that, but it didn't seem like it did anything for me. But then what happened, and this is the rough part. So it was a week later, and this is back in Wisconsin, Viroqua. I'm out raking the lawns because that's what you do in Wisconsin. And all of a sudden, just this sense of like, oh, I feel like, a little bit like the ayahuasca's coming back. I was just kind of like feeling like I'm in it a little bit.
Really?
Yeah. So it just started, and I'm like no stranger to like weird shit happening to me. So excuse me. So I just kind of sat down and just sat with it, and okay, tried to welcome it, and it just kind of passed, and it wasn't a big deal. But then this is where my whole life shifted, at least for a year. That night, I had a friend who was staying, at the house, and in conversation with this lady, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that thing's happening again. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, holy crikey. Because it's like, all of a sudden I'm like, I can't understand what she's saying, and I'm like really disoriented, and this panic wave starting. So I'm like, excuse me, trying to get the words out. Went up to my bedroom. By the time I got to my bedroom, my body's just like, shaking and convulsing. Not like convulsing like I'm having a seizure, but just this like shaking, and all of a sudden it starts to feel like my trigger. I mean, this is kind of an intense description, but it was literally like my head was being ripped off.
Whoa.
And the pain of it being ripped off. And then the terror and panic from what's happening, why does it feel like my head's being ripped off? And then the terror beget the terror, and then just in this panic wave. And that first one lasted about probably 4 hours of just in this just hell realm of being ripped in two, panic, body sensations, all this awful stuff coming out of me. And then what happened for the next year was I would go anywhere from 3 minutes to the longest was about 8 hours, where I would all of a sudden have these experiences where I was being ripped in two. And it was awful. It was awful.
I can't even begin to fathom how awful that must have been. It sounds literally beyond belief.
It was horrendous. And I went through, it was like 3 months of really intense, and then it kind of faded for about a month. But I was also starting to experience, and I didn't know the terms back then, was this place of, now I know. And again, this is all trauma related. And I'll get to the kind of the why on all this, but it was trauma related. It was dissociation. I was cracking through. But I was also experiencing this, what's called now depersonalization, derealization. So I know I was Steve, but I didn't know who Steve was. I knew I was on planet Earth, but I wasn't sure what planet Earth was. So it was this super bizarre, I'm here and I'm not here. And that would fluctuate. And I was somewhat functional. I could make it to some school events, and, I was kind of engaged, but not engaged. Fortunately, I was consulting for a company that was based in Scotland. And I was more of on a retainer. So it wasn't much responsibility, thank God, because there's times I was just out of it. And again, functional, not functional. But trying to just roll through it. And, I've got 4 kids, and it was awful. It was awful. And it would be experiences like walking in and my kids are watching a documentary on dinosaurs, and just seeing dinosaurs would just be like, I would just go into terror. Wow. And if I thought of anything out of ordinary, if I tried to think of space, I'd go into these panic waves.
Did people in your life notice this? Like, were your kids saying, "What's going on, Dad?" Or were your friends like, "Steve's having a weird day today, and they might clear their throat and move on to a different topic?
No, there was like my kids, I mean, probably would have noticed, I mean, their dad was probably a little more absent. I mean, I had to do a lot of downtime, and it wasn't like this was happening every day. It would be like I might go 5 days without anything, and then all of a sudden, oh God, here I go. And again, it could be 3 minutes. It could be, again, longest was about 8 hours. And my friends knew, and they were on, if they got a 911 from me, it was just someone please come over and just sit with me as I'm in this terrible place. And then I was consulting with a lot of, upper echelon academic researchers with psychedelics, and they're like, I don't know, just never do psychedelics again. Dennis was probably one of the most beneficial. He's like, Steve, you're just going through a shamanic initiation. It just kind of framed it like that. And part of it, I knew my body, or I'm trying to work through something. I have no idea what it is, but I'm trying to work through something. And now I got into about month 9, and I had an experience that was so awful. And that day I had an experience like in the shower. I was taking a shower, and all of a sudden it just kicked in, and I ended up collapsed on the shower floor.
Oh no.
And just started reaching for the razor blade because I'm like, I can't do this anymore.
Oh my God.
Because it was just, I mean, I'm month 9, and I'm like, am I like this the rest of my life? And it was getting worse. And so, yeah, I reached for the razor blade. I was going to like try to break it open, but then also it's, thank God, subsided. And then I'm like back, and I'm like, okay. And then that night I went through this experience where it was just, it was horrendous. I can't even put words to it, but it was like my whole body just turned to this black tar goo. And I was just poisoned and toxic, and it was just horrendous. And I can't even put words to it other than I knew I couldn't do that again. So this is where it shifted for a bit, because I ended up seeing a doctor saying I was panic attacks, and went on, got prescribed Xanax and some SSRI. And I'm not an SSRI guy, but I just, at this point, I'm like, I'll do anything.
Yeah, I bet.
But where this shifted, or you got a question, Scott?
No, please finish. You may answer it.
So what happened during that, so the Xanax did help with the wave, I was using it just PRN or as needed. So one of these panic wave thingies it wasn't a panic attack. It was just also I'm going to be ripped in two. But I would then dose with the Xanax, and it would bring it down a notch. So it started to help, but it was still there, but I was still experiencing the depersonalization, derealization. The SSRI seemed to make that worse, of like, I don't know who I am. But then what they ended up happening, and this is kind of interesting, but it was the switch that kind of got me out of this place, was they switched me from a SSRI to a SNRI. And I didn't know this. I know I was being switched, but what happened is I went into serotonin syndrome.
What's that?
Serotonin syndrome is where you're flooded with serotonin. Serotonin can be fatal. People can die from serotonin syndrome. Don't recommend it. It was, a theme here for me in these experiences. It was horrendous. What I was going through was horrendous. Serotonin syndrome is awful. And it kicked in. I'll try to keep this brief, but I was, trying to do this consulting gig, and then I was trying to type, but I couldn't type. My fingers I was just having all these twitches and tics, and I couldn't type, and I kept, sorry, not to be too graphic here.
Please, we need to know the truth.
But the serotonin syndrome leads to like tics. You get these tics, and I had no clue I was serotonin syndrome. And I thought, F-bomb me. There's something new happening here. This is worse and worse. It's getting worse. I tried to call my doctor, and still remember this. They it's trying to dial even just dial the phone took a process, and they get on and, hello, can I help you? And I couldn't talk. I was literally not to mock myself, but I couldn't talk. Because I was ticking, spasming, and in serotonin syndrome, which is tics and spasms and all this crazy stuff going on. But I made it through. The lady just hung up on me because I was some crazy man. But then I'm like, I end up on the floor in my office and just like these ticks are just going. I have no clue what it is other than I'm totally losing my mind. And it was awful. But then that night I do a little nightly meditation trying to calm everything down, and then got in bed and all of a sudden, all the ticks started. And this time it was worse. And my stomach was just like convulsing, and my face, muscles and everything was just all these ticks. And it was awful. And then it just proceeded to all of a sudden where my brain, it felt like literally, the only way I could describe it is like thousands and thousands of shards of glass were inside my brain.
Oh my God.
And then pushing out, and then they exploded. And the most intense headache it was beyond headache, but in that moment, I somewhat blacked out. And I thought I died. Because the experience was like just like the whole system just like exploded.
Oh my God.
And yeah, that was awful. And then grace of God, again, whoever was up there, I came out of it and I was like, okay, literally I started, I'm alive. I'm alive. Fuck. Oops, sorry. I'm alive. Okay. I'm alive. And I got on the phone, called my doctor, and I think I just almost died. Something's wrong. I don't know what to do. Something's wrong. And then I got a call that next morning, literally 6:30 in the morning. It's my doctor, and he's like, Steve, you're still alive. I'm like, yeah, well, that's good. You could have died. You had serotonin syndrome. My bad. I should have tapered you off the meds. I'm sorry. Don't take those meds ever again.
Whoa.
Yeah. True story. It was awful. But
are you still seeing that doctor?
No, that's back in Wisconsin.
Maybe to ask the obvious.
That's back in Wisconsin. But not even cool. What happened though, somehow it did a reset on my brain. I never recommend someone going through serotonin syndrome to do a brain reset.
Thank you. After hearing that, I'm glad.
Kids, don't do that at home. But it did this shift where the panic or these being ripped in two thingies, even without, because I stopped taking Xanax. It's just like, I'm not touching anything. Or maybe I did. I went super, 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 super low on the Xanax. But everything started to subside. But it took about 3 months by still dealing with this depersonalization, derealization. And then eventually that subsided. And that was, it was pretty much a year phase with ayahuasca.
Okay. I have to interrupt at this point.
Sure.
And I'm sure you've got a lot more to say about this, and then we'll talk about the aftermath of that. But there are some questions that I think any rational audience member is going to ask. And I'll get to the most real one last. But sure. The first one that I have to ask, if you know the answer to this, is what we've heard so far on this show and what you read about in the newspaper, or that you may even see if you do some online research, particularly in some spaces, is that these substances are in your body and then they leave, and they don't have long-term after effects to our knowledge. I'm hearing quite the opposite. Well, before I move into that, do you think, or do you know, was the ayahuasca still in you months and months later, or was the brain reset that it triggered much more permanent and dramatic than might be common in people that are less, in your own words, extreme? And I say this from someone who's been accused of being extreme himself. So I'm not saying that with judgment. In fact, I might be saying it with a little bit of pride and affinity. But answer the question.
Great question. So yeah, the ayahuasca was out of my system. Ayahuasca is not bad. I don't blame ayahuasca for this. And then I'm going to jump a little bit forward, because I do want to, I'm always challenged by how to put all this into some framework that kind of makes sense. Because what it was in hindsight was trauma. And this was specific to birth trauma. So I discovered this. I'll fast forward and then return to ayahuasca. And then I'll probably fast forward to how this eventually cleared. And this is where it gets really fascinating. So put on your seatbelts. It's going to get interesting.
I'm going to put on both the seatbelt around my lap and around my shoulders.
And this is also a message that needs to get out to what I'm going to go into of understanding these medicines and how they can affect people. So what I ended up saying, I'm going to, again, fast forward a little bit and then rewind. So I went through that experience and then came back and I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel normal, but I knew something was still in there. I went through that for some reason. There's something else in here. There's something happening in my system. I don't understand it. I'm not mentally ill. I'm not schizophrenic. I'm not insane. Mm-hmm. There's something else here. Why? Was the mantra of my life. Now it's optimizing outcomes. But it was why? So I ended up getting I went into this FDA study, the UW-Madison pharmacokinetic study for psilocybin, which ended up being 3 really, really intense experiences. But what I discovered in that process of those psilocybin sessions, I'll touch a little more on those in a bit, but this is going to segue back to the ayahuasca session. What I discovered was, and this was just kind of serendipitously, 2 weeks before I started the psilocybin study, again, 3 doses over 3 months, I did a workshop with Stan Groff, holotropic breathwork. Stan's the man in Taos, New Mexico. He's came up with holotropic breathwork. He's the guy who did all the research, probably the leading researcher in the 60s with LSD, and then came up with holotropic breathwork, which I highly recommend. But also what Stan's big on is birth trauma and talking about how birth trauma affects people.
What is birth trauma?
Birth trauma can be, like for me, birth trauma, and I didn't know all this at the time, but where I found this was, I'll get to that question. Because what I found out after my first psilocybin session, which was horrendous, birth stories were on my mind, and it happened to be my dad's 80th birthday. So I asked my dad, this birth trauma or birth story thing came out of Stan from 2 weeks ago. I don't have that, so I'm not interested in it. But I asked my dad, what's your birth story? Just trying to have conversation. Heard his birth story and asked my mom, what's your birth story? Heard hers because I'd never heard it. And then I was like, damn, I've never heard mine. And so what my mom said, the first thing was, it was awful. You were the worst of the 4 kids. It was so awful. You're a breech. They didn't know breech. So 3 men were trying to manually flip you, but it was so painful for me. So they put you
inside the womb?
Yeah. So they put me under anesthesia to knock me out so they could try to flip you over. And then they had to, was I a C-section? Then she goes, no, they pulled you out. They had to use those forceps, or I don't know how they did it, but they pulled you out. And then, I'm not going to go into some of the stuff she said. But anyway, then I went through that experience and then 4 days in a nursery. But also when I eventually got my birth records and found out also I had the umbilical cord around my neck, had to be resuscitated. 3 days later, had to be resuscitated again. But basically, I was pulled out by my head. And also I know from an iBook, or a little tangent here, but I know I also had broken ribs through that experience. And because I have a deformed chest and all these puzzle pieces start to come together. So also it's like crikey. Through the roof, birth trauma.
Bro, I'm sorry. I just have to. You just were not given a break from even before you were born.
No. It started early. It started very early.
Yeah.
Very early. So then a big aha started coming in. I didn't fully understand the full extent of the aha, but then just hearing, they had to pull you out, physically pull you out. Then I knew, because I worked in surgery for a while, the forceps, and then it was just this lightning bolt went off of like, oh my God, because for what I was experiencing for, nearly that year with ayahuasca was this sense of being ripped in two. Like my head was going one direction and my body was going the other direction. Wow. So what happened in hindsight was I was just looping in this birth trauma. My body was trying to because my mom was under anesthesia. I don't know what. I would love to see her records on this because back then, late 50s, early 60s, they do this twilight sleep thingy where they do scopolamine, morphine, and then some other drug. And I don't know if that's what she had, but she was under a general anesthetic. So I went through, so I was also, there's some major anesthetic. So I was also just anesthetized too. So everything I went through from that birth, I never got to fully process. And so during the ayahuasca session, I think probably from them snakes cleaning me out a bit, stirred up the pot a bit. And so my body was then for 9+ months trying to process the birth trauma. And it's kind of wild. But it was one of those knowings, because just literally it was this like the sensation of like, oh my God, my head's going this way and my body's going the other way, which made no sense, back then. But then I heard birth story, and then it's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Then it also made sense to, my first psilocybin session, which was horrendous, of demonic realms and all this, which then ties into Stan Grof's birth matrices of what people go through.
So you can't just sort of say something like that, let it slide. Okay, yeah, I saw demonic presences, and then, I went to McDonald's, right? Okay, what happened? Come on. Don't torture us like this.
It gets wild, Scott. It gets very wild. Yeah, again, I'm not normal on many levels of what I went through. So this, again, is an extreme case of someone with pretty extreme trauma starting from birth up to 13. And some of the trauma started very, very young for me, around the sexual abuse and sadism started very, very, very young. And so I came into this with, and I didn't, obviously I didn't know, especially the pre-verbal stuff or any of the like pre-7 stuff. But all this started coming out. And then, so in that psilocybin session, again, I went in with the intent of really wanting, a safe container as far as being in I know I had to go back in. I knew there was something unresolved in there. I had no clue, but I was again, this relentless pursuit of why did I spend that 9 months? Why?
Of course.
So got into the FDA study, which was a pharmacokinetic study. So it was looking at, for any FDA approval of any substance, it has to go through pharmacokinetics. So pharmacokinetics is looking at blood serum levels. So when does the medicine first enter the bloodstream, whatever that medicine is? When does it peak and when does it exit? So it's just a simple, like looking at blood serum levels as far as duration of the substance within, the bloodstream and urine. And then they're also looking at, we're doing these escalating doses to also look at adverse reactions to high doses. So I'm on record, honorably, to have done the largest psilocybin dose in any published FDA study. Just being a 6'2" Dutch guy. Or 6'1", I'm shrinking, Scott. I'm shrinking.
Hey, well, you know what? Better to be on the record for that than being on record for nothing. Okay, you go, Steve Elfrink.
So I entered the study and knowing it was possibly going to be rough, but I had no idea how rough it was going to be. And it was even though it was a pharmacokinetic study, it was still this classic like Johns Hopkins model, headphones, eye shades, 2 guides who were wonderful, Dan and Karen. Beautiful people, perfect set and setting. UW-Madison in the pharmacy building, but they converted this room into like a living room, beautiful couch, nice, tasty, oriental rugs, cool art on the walls, beautiful set and setting. And again, looking at pharmacokinetics, so went into the study and you had like EKGs on, they're doing blood draws, all this stuff. A lot of people say, well, you'd have a bad trip. Anyone would have a bad trip if you're getting a blood drawn and EKGs, blood pressure cuff. But actually, that was one of the highlights of the session because it framed itself for me as I was part of this sacred ritual, doing this, taking the sacred molecule. And I called them the blood angels, would come in, and they're so beautiful and graceful how they did this, all the people that were supporting this study. Kudos to all of them. But they would draw my sacred blood that had the sacred molecule, and then they would take it to the sacred lab where where the sacred scientist would then analyze my blood. And this was going to help humanity because, you know, for FDA approval, you have to go through this. So the most positive aspect of the study for me was that. And then in my final session, there was a positive aspect. But that was not a deterrence, or it didn't contribute anything. It was the more grounding, positive part about the experience. It's going through these blood draws and all the crazy stuff they had to do. But that first session was pure, like pretty much instantly nausea. And this is not, you're not using a fruiting body mushroom. This is just pure psilocybin, like 99.8%, I think 98, I don't know, as pure as possible. Nick Cozy, God bless Nick Cozy, who was the guy who was making all the psilocybin back then for all these studies, but made right there in UW-Madison, but took it and, you know, just extreme nausea and just flooded with sweat and just thought I was going to throw up. It was awful. And then it's just worse from there, where this is where, entered these demonic realms where I felt like my body was morphing and contorting and writhing into every possible demon and sinister demons. But it was me. I was the sinister demon. And but the pain of like my face being like morphed into horrific beings. And then went, you know, downhill from there into this like coffin, dark black. It wasn't even a coffin. It's just this big black box. But in the whole time of the session, it was all just black. There was no color. Everything was just black and shades of gray, but just black and awful. And then being in this like coffin thingy, trapped, but this wretched creature thing, and then things scurrying all around me, and just horrendous. And kind of this almost level of like demonic sinisterness. And really, really, really intense. And then finally, you know, like segued out at about the 4th hour or so, went to the bathroom, walked into the bathroom, I remember, and going, okay, things are moving on the walls. Okay, this is normal. I'm comfortable here. So I thought, okay, maybe I'm through the worst of it. But then I got back onto the couch and then went into perceived psychosis.
What's that?
I thought I lost my mind. I thought I went crazy. I thought I like had a split. Like I just lost my mind. It just all of a sudden I'm like laying there, had like 5 minutes in the bathroom where it felt good, lay on the couch. I think, okay. Then all of a sudden it was just like, I'm going crazy. And I went into this like, oh my God, I'm going to be the one person in a psilocybin study that's having a bad experience is going to end up in the psych ward. And I was like, oh my God, they're going to have to, I don't even think I'm going to walk out of here. They're going to have to get a wheelchair. And I just thought, I'm never going to see my kids again. And I fucked up. Sorry. I messed up the study and I'm going to ruin everything for everyone. And I'm like gone crazy. And then this is great guiding from my facilitators, because I kind of came up and I thought they're going to be so disappointed in me, my two guides, that I messed this up. So I kind of sat up, and that took me a long time to finally sit up and, you know, let them know the bad news that I've gone crazy. So I told them that. I'm like, you know, I've gone crazy. I've lost my mind. And their response, I think it was Dan first, said, awesome, Steve, you've gone crazy. Total breakdown of the operating system. Good work. Good job, Steve. You've gone crazy. Wow. And then Karen's like, oh, that's great, Steve. But it was perfect. It was perfect. Because all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute. And it was this, all of a sudden this like, this is mind. Mind's messing with me here. And it just shifted it. It shifted it out. And then I was like, okay, mind, I'm not crazy. And it just shifted it. And I brought a drum. I'm a drum guy. And grabbed my drum, and I was just like, boom, 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 boom. Okay, I'm okay. And I made it through.
Obviously.
Dose one. That was dose one, and then went downhill from there. But
okay. Before we move on and get back to the questions that I had, before I forget them, because this is so overwhelming, and I'm sure a zillion more questions are going to come out. But one thing that we have not talked about yet, I actually, hearing this entire story, particularly the ayahuasca parts earlier, I'm shocked that this has not come up in this series so far, which is the subject of flashbacks. Would you say that what you experienced in the period after your ayahuasca journeys in which you were at home and having these horrible things happen, were they what people are commonly referring to as flashbacks? Because to a layperson, that's what it sounds like. And what's the difference between a flashback and what you experienced?
That's a great question, Scott. I love your questions, by the way.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Good. I'll keep them coming.
Yes. So for me, I think the flashback thing is somewhat nebulous. For me, what I was experiencing was, again, trauma. So it wasn't anything from the medicine other than the medicine cracked through some dissociation. My body's trying to process this birth trauma. I'm freaking out from it. If someone understood dissociation, body, somatic approach, which is the focus of my work now more than anything is somatic, someone could have got me through that. But a flashback, is more of a visual experience, or more of like also, seeing something, or it's more of a brief thing here and there. I've never fully, to be honest with you, Scott, I've never really fully understood flashbacks. I've never heard a great description of it. I think it's, maybe it is a little bit of trauma gets re-triggered or resurfaces. But it seemed like it was more of a thing out of the 60s as a scare tactic than anything. But I wouldn't consider anything I went through as a flashback. And none of this is because, or that, ayahuasca's bad, psilocybin's bad. And this is also, where we will segue eventually here is into the right medicine at the right time. Yeah. And for me, more and more folks with complex PTSD, maybe psilocybin's not the best answer. And this is a whole can of worms here, because it's just as far as the complexity of what someone shows up with. Because even if you have PTSD, the spectrum of that, if there's complex PTSD, it's not like you just have complex PTSD. That's a name, a label, a box. But then who is that person? When did the trauma start? How many perpetrators? Was there someone good in that person's life, that person's personality, their sensitivity, their intelligence? Was there, in the big thing there, was there someone good in their life that could nurture or self-soothe or self-regulate through?
Well, you raise an interesting point. So as I've mentioned from the very first episode of this show, I was in counseling for 11 years to deal with PTSD. And one thing that one of my therapists told me was that from her perspective, it actually was easier dealing with war survivors and genocide survivors than people that had intrafamilial trauma. And I remember saying, how on earth can that be? She had spent many years working in African countries, I believe Rwanda in particular, where there had been civil wars and just these massacres of people. And she said, well, because in a war situation or in a genocide, you know who the enemy is. It's clear. And not only that, but you have your own group of people around you who are good or who are supporting you and helping you make it through this, as opposed to intrafamilial, where there is confusion. You think that your mother or your father or your cousins or your uncle or whoever it is loves you. And so the emotions that you are having aren't conflicting both with what's happening with you and with your feelings. And then, of course, like you said, we all have various levels of sensitivity. I'm like you, Steve. I've said this before. I'll just say it again, right? I tend to the extreme. And so, of course, I'm going to react in an extreme way. Being extreme can sometimes be really fun. Sometimes it can really be awful. I have a feeling you can relate to me. And other people are just more naturally thick-skinned, or they have just less of an emotional range as part of their underlying physiological makeup. So I hear all of that. But before we get into that segue, and we very much have to get into that segue, again, my audience is going to be asking this. I can just see her right now. She's someone sitting on her couch in downtown Kansas City, Missouri, and she's saying, Steve, after you had all that with ayahuasca, you decided to do more psychedelics?
Yes.
Well, doesn't she demand an answer? Doesn't she deserve to hear why? Because I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was this relentless pursuit of why. I had no trust in Western psychiatry, no trust in Western psychiatry meds, other than they suppress everything. It was just this drive to understand. It's hard to put words to it, other than a drive to understand why. I mean, it was just like I'm a little, I wouldn't say obsessive compulsive, but I I don't know, maybe it's my Dutch background or something. I don't know, but just like stubborn, I am going to figure this out. I'm going to do anything and everything it takes to make it through this. I want my life. I want to experience life. It was just this drive more than anything. And I had the greatest trust in, psychedelic medicines as something that's going to help me through. Even with that awful experience, I was willing to like, okay, I'm going to keep going. I'm not stopping.
So you had the psilocybin experiences. They were mixed, to say the least.
Yeah. So this is where it gets interesting also. So I did the 3 doses, and then I'm just going to touch a little bit on the third dose. Because the third dose was the highest dose in FDA published study, 59.2 milligrams of pure psilocybin. Standard dose of psilocybin in any of the studies is typically 25 milligrams. That's kind of the sweet spot they've discovered for what they're looking for in a psilocybin study is the mystical experience. And 25 is kind of what you needed for most folks. So what I did was a 59 milligram dose, big dose, and very, 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 very intense. And it was one of the more challenging experiences of my life. And what made it challenging was within like 5 minutes, it felt like 5 or 7 minutes, there was no like ramp up. It was like all of a sudden I took the psilocybin and propelled into human suffering. And literally I was flung my arms back, and I'm like, I'm not a religious guy at all, but I was like, God, this is like Jesus stuff. But then all of a sudden, that was my final thought. And then I was just propelled into human suffering. And I was saying out loud, like, this isn't mine. Why me? Why me? Why am I experiencing this? And what the feeling was, or the experience was, everyone who's ever suffered in the universe or in the world was being channeled through me. So it was just anyone who like, but it was gnarly, like tortured, raped, lost a loved one, dismembered. I mean, just gnarly stuff. But their like anguish, their pain, their, everything they were feeling was coming through like my belly and then up out through me. And I thought I was screaming for like 2 hours. That was my internal experience of just this ongoing, endless scream. They're like, no, you weren't screaming. You're just writhing. And then, so I went from this, this experience of this, suffering being through me, and then fell into this, I can still see it, this white hot ring, like this abyss, the abyss of suffering that I fell into. And then it was just lined with literally thousands and thousands and thousands of souls, but they're all just still screaming and just like suffering, and their scream would go through and out me. And I was just kept like, why me? Why me? Why this suffering? And it felt like it was going to be endless. I thought, because there was enough of me a little bit online, like I'm stuck here for the rest of my life. This is my life. And then that's actually hard to say.
And it's hard to hear.
Because it was awful. Like some of these places, there's no words. I mean, like the Unity Consciousness place, thank God had that. But some of these like suffering places that I've gone through, off the charts. No words. But then grace of God or whatever, I don't know, because it kind of got worse. But then I went from, that was like a 2-hour window. Then I went into 2 hours of personal suffering. And it was this, I was the most wretched soul that ever existed. I was parched. I was starving. I was like slumped over on the floor. Every one of my sessions, I ended up on the floor writhing about. But I slumped over on the floor, and I was just beyond wretched. And just, I can't even put words to wretched soul. And then there was a bottle of water. I would just take this little sip, and I was just looping in this, but I'd take the little sip of water, and then I'd die. And then I'd like resurrect, and then I'd be suffering and wretched soul. But it was all me. And it was, again, just, I can't, like the parch, like I hadn't drank water in 2 years. I haven't eaten in 3 years. And that feeling, and then a sip and then die, and just kept going and going. But I finally got to a point, and this is about 2 hours of that. And then got to a point where all of a sudden I was able to just sit up. And then it's just a point where the experience shifted, where now all of a sudden I was witness to the suffering and witnessing myself suffer. And then I was just staying with that. And then this was probably more profound than the unity consciousness experience. It was probably the top experience of my life. Yeah, there it is. Sorry.
I'm here with you, brother.
But some of these are like, some of them are so painful and some of them are so profound. And this one is so profound, and it's hard to put words to this one. So this one I ended up in, I went to witnessing myself in the suffering and just being with, and then all of a sudden everything kind of disappeared, and all of a sudden I was in this infinite horizon of just gray. And it wasn't bad gray. I've experienced the bad gray. But it was more like just infinite gray dust. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden I was sitting there, but the I was this, like, I call him bone man. It wasn't a skeleton. It was this, like, just this bone man.
Right.
And what was interesting there, though, I was in this stateless state. So it wasn't a non-dual state. So the only thing I found close to describe where I went to was from Franklin Merrill Wolff, this book, I can't remember the name of the book, but the state called high indifference. And it's also mentioned in some obscure Buddhist texts of being, because where I went to was above unity consciousness, above suffering. So I was sitting there in this, eventually the bone man thingy just collapsed into dust, and there was no object. There was just this awareness, but there was no awareness, which is this place of paradox and really hard to explain. But then this awareness that had no awareness would just kind of, it's hard to explain this, but it was so concrete of this non-state that was a state, but it was a non-state, glances to the left. And there was the ring of suffering. And looking at that, it was like, meh, it means nothing. Sounds a little nihilistic, but it was just this above it. It's high indifference. Then I looked over and there was unity consciousness to the right. And it was like, meh, means nothing. But it was this state of perfection where there was no perfection. And it was, so profound. So profound and such a gift. And I can't put words fully to it. And then I did this, all this sounds sometimes bizarre, but then I dipped into like lion consciousness. And I was like fully embodied in this lion. And it was like, meh, it means nothing. There's this place of meh. And then dipped into this Danish warrior, and I could feel the helmet on his nose and the spear thingy he was holding. And I was in this like very noble, courageous, I could feel this warrior spirit thing. And it was like, meh, it means nothing. And then also I went into monkey consciousness, which was just like, oh, that's silly. But it just meant nothing. But then I would come back into this place of high indifference, and it was so profound. Because it was a stateless state of perfection where there is no perfection. And there's no meaning, there's no, there's pure wisdom, but there is no wisdom. There's pure knowing, but there is no knowing. It was just pure paradox. And I came out of that, and sitting on that couch, room 1010, UW-Madison Pharmacy Building, the most I've never felt better in my life. In that moment of just pure awareness, pure emptiness. But it was also this place of like love, but not like, it wasn't like mystical love or like the unity consciousness love. It was just pure presence of being. And it was so, and oh no, I can't even, it wasn't beautiful. It was just was. And I was just this man who had this experience that one, yes, that one's forever changed my life too. And also for me that, I mean, having these like mystical states, I've been, for me, like going through those doses of hell in the FD or that psilocybin study to get to that point of what I experienced, and not as a bragging right, but not many people have gone there. And that's not, I'm not trying to like, oh, I'm special or anything. I was just grace of God, whatever, he took me there. And I say God, not in a biblical God, just whatever source or whatever. But I got to experience that place, and that stays with me forever. The unity consciousness stays stays with me forever, just knowing that's there. And so that experience had a huge shift in my life. But what's interesting, I went into kind of this non-dual, I was really into non-dualism, and there's so many stories around. I know we got a brevity moment here, but there's so much that I went through of these spontaneous downloads and insights that were life-changing for me through a lot of this phase. But what I found, and this is where I want to kind of speed up a little bit. Any questions there, Scott? I'm sorry. Get on a roll.
No,
here.
I just have a comment, which is, although I and anyone who is listening and watching didn't experience this state of indifference or elevated indifference without indifference at the same time, you described it so vividly that I feel like on some level I understand it.
Oh, wow.
I get it. I feel it. I know I don't really feel it because I wasn't there experiencing it, but you took us there to such an extent that I do feel it. And I think it's important to acknowledge with any guest when that happens, because what you've done in sharing this and sharing it so vividly is actually reframe my own thinking, and I have no doubt the thinking of others who hear or watch this about some of the most fundamental elements of our existence, even how we think about spirituality, even limitations that we may not realize that we have in how we conceptualize what's in the beyond. So no, I don't have a question. I think what you shared, frankly, is beyond questioning. It's something to hear, to take in, to ponder, and to feel.
No, I appreciate that, Scott. I appreciate your reflection back on all this. And I'm also touched that it had an impact on you.
It did.
I mean, I'm at that place in my life is where, like, I've been through, I mean, we haven't touched on the trauma, and that's not going to be the focus. I mean, the details of it, but the depths of hell. And also these depths of like brilliance and, these beautiful, beautiful states. So it's just, I'm a guy who's just experienced both ends and everything in between. And the more I can, that's why I appreciate this opportunity, Scott, to have this podcast, but get some of these, messages out. And then segueing to, this was probably for me, like segueing now, and using that term a lot, into the most, for me, save it best to last, part of the most important aspect of my work and what my message to the world is this next segment here. And I'll try to, we're going about the 2-hour mark. But this is important. Because this is, I mean, for me, where I'm going to go is with all these mystical insights, these profound experiences that you can see still touch me today. Going through those, also, like after the psilocybin study, I probably had the biggest window of really good time in my life of about 1.5 years of pretty solid. So when I launched my first iteration of Terra, doing these psychedelic therapy symposiums, was really entrenched in the psychedelic space. I was happy. It was a great phase of my life. But then what happened, so, the most profound experience, I thought, I discovered birth trauma, I understood the ayahuasca thingy, and I thought everything I went through with the psilocybin session was tied to birth trauma, unbeknownst to me. And I thought I cured myself. I thought finally I got to the root of everything. The answer to my whole, trauma history was this birth trauma. I'm a new man. Let's bring on the world, take on the world. And then what happened was I ended up spiraling down again. So I ended up, and this, I know in brevity, I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit here. So what I found was, and I also started getting, I was involved with the underground world, doing ceremonies, facilitation, started to see more like non-responders, started to question, like, wow, what I went through was freaking awful in this study. Is that the best method? Seeing other people having challenging experiences, lost my oldest daughter's spirit mom, didn't do godparents, did a spirit mom. Her husband died from suicide from an ayahuasca ceremony in Peru, went through into hell realms and ended up killing himself the next day.
God.
And that was like, okay, this stuff, it's a little bit of disillusionment kicking in. Had a friend of a friend who went to Peru, did ayahuasca, became very destabilized. After 6 months, no one being able to help him back at home, killed himself. So started questioning some of this. And
before we go any further, this is important.
Yeah.
Because this goes as to the dangers of psychedelics, which again, I've pledged as the host of this podcast to be honest and to keep it real.
Yeah.
So we're not going to gloss over this. And I'm not saying you are glossing over it, but
Yeah.
I think it's so important to raise. What do you think happened there? Do you think this was that they were with poor shamans or poor facilitators? Do you think that it was just, that's the way it is sometimes?
Nope. None of the above.
Oh, well, then please give us your thoughts.
Trauma. So
Their
this
own
is what we're
trauma
gonna
just
say.
overwhelmed them?
Yeah, and this is what I want to segue to, because this is what, really changed my life at a fundamental level, of core level. So what I think happens to folks, and I work with a lot of folks who have been destabilized from psychedelics, is this, it's back to, I call it trauma ball. So there's, back to the fight, flight, or freeze, the freeze of dissociation. What exists under that dissociation? So dissociation is where we just kind of disconnect, where our body, from a biological perspective, the body gets shut down. You're flooded with these opioids, up to equivalent, I think it's like 5 to 7 milligrams Bessel van der Kolk. Body Keeps the Score is probably one of the best resources for some of this information.
I read it. It's excellent, by the way.
Yeah.
Recommend it to
Yeah.
anyone.
So what happens is we're literally just drugged, and in that drug state, standard memory disappears. So your body or your mind isn't recording what happened, but your body records everything. So your body's still, even if the assault is happening, you hit that point of overwhelm, because a person can't sustain fight or flight with the adrenaline, the heartbeat. Your body can't stay there. So your body's like, okay, we're at a point of overwhelm. Let's flood this person with opioids to shut the system down. But what happens, the messed up part here of our evolutionary process is, well, part of more from culture, because we don't allow ourselves to process stuff, but all that trauma gets stuck underneath that dissociation. So it's never processed. So whatever happened prior and then what happened during the dissociation still lives on within the body. So what can happen with psychedelics is this dissociation, and for me it's like a lid. So if you have some people will be listening to this just on audio. So if you have trauma ball, so for me it's just, and this is simplifying it incredibly. You have trauma ball, and then on top of trauma ball is this lid of dissociation that just kind of holds it down, holds it safe. And it's, somewhat of a protective measure, but our bodies seek homeostasis. Our bodies want to, process everything. Our body wants to keep us at 98.6 degrees, want to keep us breathing. If we start exercising, we breathe faster, we eat food, we pull out the, nutrients, we digest it, moves out of us. Same thing with trauma. Body wants to process trauma. So for a lot of folks, what's showing up, if it's in the here and now, depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, it's that trauma ball starting to just leak out, because body's just trying to process any way possible. So if we're triggered, someone says something else that we're reactive, we're triggered, normally what that's doing is just body's going, oh, opportunity. I get to feel, I get to move a little bit of this out. So if we're experiencing trauma or depression, anxiety in the here and now, a lot of that stemming from childhood trauma. So what can happen in these, psychedelic sessions, like what happened to, my spirit mom's husband, this trauma ball can get opened up. So this lid of dissociation through the power of psychedelics can break through that dissociation. But then, I think I said this earlier, but it repeats or deserves to be repeated again, is what can happen is if that comes up, especially if it's the gnarliest stuff, and that's what I was experiencing, is the pre-verbal trauma. Because again, I know I said this before, but saying it again, that there's no delineation of that early childhood trauma, pre-verbal trauma, that says, assigns meaning to this is pain, or even this is terror, this is panic, this is grief. It's just one ball of, emotional energy. But then what can happen is the lid of dissociation comes open, and all of a sudden that energy starts to emerge. Then that energy, as we know, any psychedelic is going to amplify what's happening. So on the good side, you're listening to the Beatles on LSD, and they're like angels from heaven. Take a bite of an orange, and it's like, oh my God, nectar of the gods. Everything's heightened. But it'll also amplify feelings. So this energy of these air quote feelings comes out, and it doesn't make sense because it's from a baby. It's from a 2-year-old. It's from a 1-year-old. Yeah. That starts coming up, and then it gets amplified by the psychedelic, and all of a sudden the mind is going, WTF? What is this? And then it tries to assign meaning to it. So my experience with myself, a lot of clients, is that a lot of times that energy, and this is what happened to me in session 1 with the FDA study, is the closest it can come to as far as a description is demonic, because it just feels so weird. And we have to take something from the here and now to apply meaning to it, because our minds are meaning makers. And so it assigns this demonic energy to it, right. Or not energy, a label to it.
Right.
And that's where then people just all of a sudden it's like, I'm going crazy. And then also within that is this paranoia and like, I'm going insane and I'm not safe. And where am I? But now what you've got is, what this boils down to is it ends up with this structural dissociation. So now you've got, like for me, I had like 52-year-old Steve and that psilocybin session. And I also had day-old Steve. And then also going back to my ayahuasca, that year breakdown, where depersonalization, derealization lives is where you have this, I call it dual activation, basically, because you have, where there was back then, 48-year-old, or let's just say 50-year-old Steve and baby Steve interacting real time in real life. And I don't know, baby Steve exists. Baby Steve doesn't know Steve exists. So that's where this place of depersonalization, derealization, where you don't know what's real. And also, I think even tangent here, but not related, in Oregon, there's this big news where a pilot command the airplane and crash it. But, and he, did psilocybin 48 hours before. Yes. But I think what happened is some trauma ball got open there. He's in this depersonalization, derealization. So he's got adult pilot and, 3-year-old, whatever, I can't remember the guy's name, operating at the same time. And like what he said is, I just want to wake up. That's why he did it. I want to wake up. But you're in this, like, it's awful because I've experienced it. And I've experienced it not just from ayahuasca, but just the work I started doing after the after the psilocybin session, when I started going into my trauma. So where it boils down to, and this is like a message that has to get out, I think, of just how to understand this and how to frame this, to understand that when trauma gets awakened, that it can lead to extreme destabilization. But it's this kind of psychobiological phenomenon. So again, what you end up with classically would be termed structural dissociation. But usually structural dissociation shows up in someone who's some level of trauma that's presented early on, and then they have kind of this, it's also known as a split. Mm-hmm. But it can also happen through psychedelics. I call it iatrogenic structural dissociation, induced by the psychedelic. But it's not the psychedelic's fault. Mushrooms aren't bad, LSD's not bad, ayahuasca's not bad. Folks with trauma and again, depends on the complexity of trauma, are at risk of this getting opened up. And without the framework or contextual understanding, people don't get it. And I mean, this is like, again, a lot of the clients I work with, and also, sorry, this is where I kind of start just ranting. But also, sometimes in the psychedelic space, there's, a non-responder. And this is also important because the non-responder is also related to dissociation. So like for me in my MDMA sessions where I had no effect, it's like when the dissociation meets MDMA, or AKA opioids meet the MDMA, the opioids win. And so because there's so my body, so what happens with any of us with trauma, we learn very early on, things get intense, uncomfortable, we go poof.
Yeah.
We go into dissociation. Oh, there's stress. I'm just going to flood myself with, opioids and go into dissociation. I used to call it, I didn't understand this, but I would call it, I'd go into the mud. Or I could be in minor conflict with my ex-wife, and then all of a sudden I would just I wasn't there. Literally, it's like I would say, it's like I'm flooded with chemicals. A switch goes off. But I was flooded with chemicals. So back to the non-responder, and this is what I started seeing in the underground work. Someone could do, this is a lot of the clients I work with who all have a lot of complex PTSD, structural dissociation, were non-responders. One client who went through 16 ayahuasca ceremonies with never much of an effect. I have friends who, known trauma to some degree, didn't know it back then, but could do psilocybin with no effect. And it's, again, with MDMA, even with ketamine, I've worked with clients, because I work with ketamine, can give them, like 500 milligrams, a high dose of ketamine, troche, and feel sober, even with ketamine.
Fascinating.
But that's on the good side. Other than what will happen though sometimes in the psychedelic space is you have a non-responder. So it's like, oh, they have a tough ego. We got to break through that ego. Let's up the dose. And then in this, I can share this. This is someone who reached out to me and who was willing for me to share this, but someone who went through a psilocybin session, not part of the licensed program here in Oregon, but someone I met, and they're, I met at a conference, psychedelic conference, and they're there looking for a facilitator, and I got to know the person just by chance. And I told her flat out, you shouldn't do psilocybin. Because I could sense in her system dissociation. I knew you can sense some level of trauma there, and just like psilocybin, don't do it. Start lower, start with, low dose ketamine, explore this slowly. But she, and everyone has their own choice, but decided to find a facilitator, did psilocybin, and they gave her 2 grams because she had never done psychedelics before, non-responder. Totally sober. Okay, we're going to wait an hour and we'll give you 2 more grams. So I gave her 2 more grams, non-responder. Like, something's wrong with your gut biome or something else. So let's wait 4 hours and we'll give you 5 grams. So then they upped her dose to 5 grams. So now she's got, the 4 grams is somewhat tapered, but still saying hello. And now 5 grams. So 9 grams floating around in her system. And then all of a sudden, it took a little bit, but all of a sudden, she's blown open.
Wow.
But now she's at a place of, paranoia, can't be in the same room with the guide, in a panic state, terror, but trauma ball got opened. And for that lady, it took her, 3 months to come back to baseline, had to go on more meds. But that's and again, with me going into this and, I'm not opposed. I'm not, trying to be anti-psychedelics. I'm a fan. I'm an advocate. I believe in the power of them. But I think there's this another level of education and understanding that has to happen with these medicines, especially when there's trauma, especially when there's complex trauma. And in saying that, I know a lot of folks, with PTSD have had benefit from these medicines. And I know a lot of, and what gets reported, usually is the success stories. And I know there's other folks out there who have had very, very challenging experiences. But now it's almost culturally not, people don't want to talk about that because it's like, I failed. People internalize that as something's wrong with me, or, nothing works for me, or I did it wrong. So a lot of people are, hiding in the woods, not literally, but anyways, Scott, I'm kind of on a rant there, and I kind of maybe
that's fine. This is actually a perfect place for us to move into a different phase of our conversation. But for those who may have just taken in what you had to say, Steve, I do want to let folks know that the whole concept of a bad trip, the people do have experiences that are traumatic and terrible, and what that can mean and the implications of that will be the subject of a forthcoming episode with a journalist who is more than happy to talk about his own horrible journey and how that changed him and what he believes that it means. Steve, we've covered a lot. And we could easily go on. There are potential topics that I had on my list here that we could talk about for 5-6 more hours. I'm realizing as we're going into this conversation. Yeah. We've gone on a journey with you. Again, I've been deeply affected by it. It's been comprehensive, and it has radically shifted how I view this whole subject. Let's talk a little bit more about where this took you and how that relates to what you do now, what drove you to Webdelics.
So great. Yeah, thank you for that. So what happened, and we'll keep this brief. I can do brief on this one. So like I was saying, I was going into this kind of disillusioned state with psychedelics, kind of questioning, knowing there's got to be something else here. It was at my third psychedelic symposium through Omterra that I invited this gentleman named Saj Razvi, who's out of, I think, Colorado now, to present on ketamine, because I wanted someone who was trying to present on, to present on ketamine. But what I got was a whole lot more in a good way. So he was instrumental as far as starting to open me up to more about the subconscious, around trauma. And he was my entry point into more of the somatic focus.
When you say somatic, what does that mean exactly? For those, again, that's an SAT word.
Body.
Thank you.
Body. So standard psychedelic therapy focuses on kind of brain on up. So insight, default mode network, mystical experience, it cures everything. Not so much. Not for everyone. My basic premise is insight's not going to heal trauma. It can give an adjunct, but then trauma is also the spectrum. But if there's complex trauma, early childhood trauma, insight's not going to do it. You got to go into this core. We got to bring, part of my mission is also, we got to bring body into psychedelic therapy. Body. So Saj came, presented, opened my eyes to someone saying something a little different and bringing in some more of the somatic focus. So I started kind of consulting with Saj, his business partner, Jen Pfizer at Innate Path in Denver, who were focused on this somatic model that came out of the lineage of Peter Levine. A lot of people know Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. And then Eric Walterstorff needs credit here, who was Peter Levine's, one of his students, PhD students, who then refined this model that I currently work with, which is focused more on the autonomic nervous system. And this could be a whole separate episode to dive into this. So
maybe we'll have to have it. You opened the door. I'm blaming you.
So for me, one of the more profound experiences of my life was my first cannabis, just working with cannabis, 2 hits of cannabis, and this model, again, out of Peter Levine, Eric Walterstorff. Saj is the one who brought in medicine and Jen Pfizer to kind of as an accelerator to it. But it basically inhibits all standard coping mechanisms of twitches, deep breaths, trying to center ourselves to stay calm, anything related to that, where you just can't move. And then take a little bit of cannabis on board to get executive functioning down, and body gets activated. So my first session was profound, because stuff my body was doing, I had no idea was humanly possible. I didn't know it existed, as far as the amount of energy of stuff starting to come up out of me. And this is, again, this could be a whole conversation. So what it really shifted me to in my practice personally, and then diving head first, because this was just a whole other aspect to psychedelic therapy that made me go, oh my God, this works. at a level that nothing else has ever worked for me before. So I, was working with Innate Path, and then eventually Saj and I launched the Psychedelic Somatic Institute, which was focused on this model and training therapists. And then I left Psychedelic Somatic Institute to start Terra and to work specifically in this model. So that's what I've been doing for the last 2.5 years, is working with this model, working with cannabis, ketamine, and more of the somatic focus. And where it goes into is, and it's what I'm really working with, is dissociation and getting to the root of trauma, of these experiences, of all this held reactivity. And now also incorporating psilocybin as a licensed facilitator, but a lot of the people I talk to who come to me, like for psilocybin, I steer them more if I dive in and notice, okay, there's some dissociation,
Right.
a lot of trauma there. Let's start, I'm a fan of low and slow. Let's clear out the canoe a little bit before we take you into the ocean.
Right. Wow.
But the whole somatic thing is, again, we could easily do 2 hours just on somatic.
And
so now my focus is the somatic thing, working with Webdelics, which is home sweet home, because there's wonderful people like Scott. And but there's this openness with Webdelics to talk about this other side. Yeah. That was one of the huge things for me to work with Webdelics, is because I kind of gave my dog and pony show and all this of some of my even sharing some of these experiences with these folks who started Webdelics, and there was an interest. So I'm also, beyond my work with Webdelics, also working with a nonprofit called the Healing Advocacy Fund on their safety committee. And Healing Advocacy Fund is responsible for helping to roll out the psilocybin program in Oregon, also in Colorado. So they work with facilitators, people who are trained to do this, to be facilitators with psilocybin, the service centers where you have to do the psilocybin facilitation, the manufacturing, and then even the labs. So super honored to be part of that team. Heidi and Sam, incredible people. Sam would be great to get on the podcast.
Well, maybe we'll talk about that.
So really good people. But my focus there is safety. So, and also another receptive group of folks. But my main mission here, Scott, more than anything, is somewhat to be a voice of reason, and also representing the subset of people that are going to possibly have challenging experiences, and wanting to understand better through better screening, what medicine is right for that person. Maybe not, again, starting with psilocybin and 5 grams right off the bat, maybe ketamine. When MDMA comes online, maybe MDMA is better, but also trying to help get the word out for when people are destabilized. Yeah. How to put framework around that. And again, like this poor, my heart goes out to this pilot that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. I mean, it's awful when he's in this place of what the heck happened. And, for me, there's an understanding to what happened. And around trauma, structural dissociation, he ended up into depersonalization, derealization. But anyway, more education on that as this rolls out to the masses. And the other challenge here is most of the folks coming into this first wave, have tried everything, and they're desperate people. And so setting expectations for these folks too. So again, firm believer, advocate of psychedelic therapy, and then we need to learn more. We need to, for me, like I said, at some point, my new mantra is optimizing outcomes. How do we make this more efficacious? How do we make this more safe? Let's understand this better. Let's understand dissociation. And, again, that could be a whole topic, but dissociation has to come into the discussion around psychedelics. People need to understand it. So that's kind of my final spiel on all this until next episode. But any questions around that, Scott?
What a spiel it's been.
It's been
Steve,
quite a ride.
It has been. I believe this has been an important ride for the show and for the audience to have been on. There has been, and I truly mean this here, a lot to chew on with everything that you've shared. Closing out, a few of the takeaways involve the reconceptualization of spirituality, suffering, and what we commonly associate with transcendence that I mentioned earlier when you talked about your final psilocybin experience of the three that were part of that initial grouping. I also have a different understanding of the relationship of complex PTSD to the psychedelic experience, as well as a different conceptualization of what a bad psychedelic experience can be, what it can mean. I also have reinforced in a way that shows compassion, realism, and is not didactic around the risks associated with psychedelic use. We said at the beginning of this episode, as we do at the beginning of every episode, we're here to find out the truth and get rid of the myths.
Yes.
You've done a lot of that.
All the myths. Yes.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And Scott, again, I want to just a kudos and a thank you for the work you're doing and the work you're doing on yourself and how you're bringing this to more folks.
Thank you.
We need more Scotts in the world. So
we
thank
truly,
you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. And we truly are in this together.
Yeah.
For those of you who have enjoyed this episode, I want you to be sure to come back for future episodes. In those upcoming episodes, particularly in light of everything that I've heard today, I will be revealing my own decision about whether a psychedelic journey is one that I am ready to experience and want to experience. And we're going to have a series of episodes that talks about some of the issues that are related to those who make such a choice. Like we mentioned earlier, the episode about the bad trip. We're going to talk about how to prepare for your first psychedelic journey and a lot more. Then after that, we're going to be exploring many substances in depth so that you can understand not just what psychedelics are generally, or not just the broad contours of what particular molecules and substances are and can do, but really where they came from, who uses them, what for, and why. It's going to be an incredible journey, and I cannot wait to go on it with everyone who is listening to and watching this show. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow us on all of our social media channels: Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. Also, do not hesitate to go to your favorite audio channel, whether it's Apple or Spotify or Samsung or anywhere, and subscribe to this show and leave us a 5-star review. Also, on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to us there and leave some comments on this as well as the other episodes that we have. Once you've done that, tell everyone that you know about Webdelics and what we're doing. Also, while you're in that frenzy of activity, don't forget to go to our website, webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And then sign up to our email list and subscribe to our blog so you can get up-to-date, accurate, unbiased, and credible information about plant medicine and psychedelics. Then, above all else, my friends, make sure that you come back for another episode of the Webdelics podcast.